Now, we have two major types of inflation which can affect an economy. We have demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. And it's really important whenever you're talking about inflation to try to figure out which type of inflation it is that's happening within the economy. The reason it's so important to make sure that you're talking about the right type of inflation is that the policies to correct the inflation or to control the inflation will be very different. And indeed, just the different types of inflation have different implications for the economy and different levels of severity. But demand pull inflation is an increase in the general price level as a result of higher levels of economic activity. That's what we mean when we're talking about demand pull inflation. So inflation, an increase in the general price level as a result of higher levels of economic activity. And again, as with a lot of other concepts, that there are a few different ways actually that we can think about this. So we could, for instance, think about it in terms of our economic cycle. So if we thought about it in terms of our economic cycle, then we would have economic activity against time, and we would have our trend rate of economic activity growth, and then we would have our actual rate of economic growth that would cycle around it. And demand pull inflation is the sort of thing that we would find in this period, the period of time where the actual rate of economic activity was higher than the trend rate of economic activity. In other words, this is a sort of inflation that we would associate with a boom or a period of economic strength in some way. Another way that we refer to this area here is a positive output gap. And that means that we are temporarily producing at a higher level than our trend rate of growth. So that's how we can think about it in terms of the economic cycle. If we think about it in terms of, I suppose, slightly more sophisticated analysis, though, in terms of our aggregate demand and aggregate supply, let's draw out here our starting point. Really, we're going to use the classical model here to begin with. So we've got our price level and real output on our axes. We've got our vertical long-run aggregate supply curve as a result of our classical assumption. And to begin with, we are going to start with a situation where we've got the short-run equilibrium, i.e. the current situation, the actual situation, is on our long-run trend rate of economic activity, and that corresponds to this price level. Now, if we have a situation where aggregate demand rises in the economy, now remember that aggregate demand itself cannot just increase. Okay, aggregate demand is made of the components C, I, G, and X minus M. So consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net trade. So aggregate demand can't just increase by itself, but if one of those components increases, then what will happen is that the AD line will shift to the right. So if we refer to the previous one as AD1, this now becomes AD2, and what you will notice here is that we have an increase in the price level on the vertical axis from P1 to P2, and that increase in the price level over here, this is the demand pull inflation, or demand pull inflationary pressure would be a better way of describing it. Depends a little bit on where we were to start with. So we've got demand pull inflationary pressure being demonstrated on the vertical axis here by the increase from P1 to P2. Now, I said before that this depends a little bit on where we were before. Obviously, on the diagram there, I started aggregate demand at the point where we were at our trend rate of growth. We were at YF. If aggregate demand had started from a point to the left of that, then actually the increase in aggregate demand would have probably had a less dramatic effect on inflation within the economy. And that's something that we can see if we think about the Keynesian model and we look at the Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve. So if we move this up just a little bit, then I can put the Keynesian one in underneath. So the Keynesian situation, remember, makes different assumptions about the ability to have spare capacity in the long run. So the Keynesian long run aggregate supply curve is shaped a bit more like that. And demand pull inflation for Keynesians would be caused by a movement to the right of AD along that long run aggregate supply curve. So we would have a situation like that, and then the same idea as before, that the increase in the price level from P1 to P2 is the demonstration of the demand pull inflationary pressure. Now, the reason that it's quite nice to use the Keynesian model here is because the magnitude of that inflation depends on the starting point of AD. For instance, if I draw the same amount of aggregate demand increase but higher up, so rather than starting at AD1 and moving to AD2, we are starting higher up, we're starting at AD3 and moving to AD4. Now, the size of the AD shift in each case is basically the same. We are obviously further over to the right than we were before, although that's not quite so relevant when we're talking about the inflation. But what we can see here is that the increase in inflation that we see here by that second shift is of a much greater magnitude than the level of inflation for the initial shift. So when we think about the demand pull inflationary pressure, you can use any of these diagrams to demonstrate it. I think the aggregate demand and aggregate supply ones give you more chance for analysis. But also bear in mind that the Keynesian one also gives you this extra level of evaluation, because you can always say that the magnitude of the inflationary pressure depends on where we are, or more accurately, where we start on our long-run aggregate supply. Keynes was saying that essentially along this bit here, the bit that's basically flat, you can have economic growth here and a reduction in unemployment without any without any corresponding inflationary pressure kicking in. But the closer we get to the vertical bit, as we move around the elbow of the curve here, the bigger the trade-off becomes, and the increases in real output, and therefore the reductions in unemployment, become harder and harder and harder to get without experiencing some form of demand pull inflation. But just to go back to the start then, demand pull inflation is a situation where we have an increase in the general price level as a result of higher levels of economic activity. And we take that in this case to mean that there is an increase in AD. So demand pull inflation is an increase in the general price level shown on the vertical axis as a result of a shift to the right of aggregate demand. And that will be because of an increase in one or more of the aggregate demand components.